Welcome to our Ideas to Impact podcast series, where we'll be talking to experts that ultimately give actionable advice to climate and sustainable founders. I'm Magda, I'm your host. I'm founder of Jobs for Planet. We are a staffing firm that focuses on sustainability, renewable energy, and climate tech. And today I'm very pleased to have the wonderful Ines Sánchez Castillo as our guest. Welcome, Ines.
Hi, Magda. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Ines is Spanish, French, and Belgium. So from three different places.
One of my parents is Spanish, the other is half French, half Belgian. So kind of a bit both, but I feel mostly Spanish because that's where I grew up.
So Ines studied hospitality in Lausanne, Switzerland, and she started her career at Deliveroo in Australia, where she was part of the launch team. And then after that, she fell in love with the speed and challenges of scaling food businesses. So with that in mind, she searched for experiences that would give her the skills and exposure to becoming a founder herself. And then she landed at Gorillas and then Choco before doing her MBA and then founding Beans. So Beans achieved 1 million in revenue in their second year of operating, helped more than 450 FMCGs like Nestle and Danone, huge names, to reduce their waste. Why did you start Beans?
Yeah, so my co-founder and I met when we worked at Gorillas together. So where he was launching the France team, I was launching the Spain team. So we got to work together very closely for a few months. We collectively had about 15 years of experience in the food sector. So that's the sector that we were kind of legitimate in as founders. And that's why we chose the food tech space to research something to build in. So we knew that food waste was the biggest problem in the food space. So we spent about 6 to 8 months researching food waste to fully understand its dynamics, right? So the different types of waste that existed, what solutions were already in place, was there any regulation to be aware of? And we found that 3%, so more than half of all the waste, happens during the first stages of the food chain, so during the production and transformation stages. And that is what I like to call waste at the industrial level, as opposed to waste at the consumer level, which companies like Too Good To Go are already tackling incredibly well. So that's the part that we felt was a bit like unexplored, and that's why that's the part that we decided to focus on. So Beans essentially is a system created to help fast-moving consumer goods companies reduce and ultimately eradicate their waste. And we do so by managing their unsold inventory, which most of the time represent between 1 to 2% of any FMCG's forecasted sales in a year, which in absolute terms is a lot of food.
How much food would you say that is? How would you quantify it? More or less. I don't expect you to have
that's actually one of the parts that's a little tricky because some brands are going to describe it more in terms of number of products. Others are going to not give absolute numbers at all and are going to talk about a percentage of their annual sales. Others are going to talk in terms of tons. So it varies a lot. What I can tell you is that in a little over 2 years, Beans has saved 25,000 tons of products, perfectly good products, from going to waste.
Can you briefly explain how that works? So how exactly did Beans save it? What was like the system in place? More or less.
Yeah, so the way that we worked is that we developed partnerships with the FMCGs, so companies like Danone, Nestle, smaller brands also, because every brand has its own organization, its own structure. Sometimes it happens at the head brand level, sometimes it happens at the individual level. So that's a challenge in itself, really understanding how it works within each individual brand. But essentially the way that we worked is that through these partnerships, we gained exclusive access to this unsold inventory. And what I mean by unsold inventory is that this is stock that FMCGs or brands cannot sell to supermarkets because it's either, products that are too close to expiry to be sold to supermarkets, but that are still good for consumers to buy, products that have, old packaging, products that have seasonality, so like chocolates during the Christmas period or Easter, that kind of thing, or even what I call marketing issues. So, for example, during the World Cup, Beek is going to release a bunch of pens that have the World Cup branding, and at the end of the World Cup, well, supermarkets no longer, or
season's over.
Yeah, exactly. Don't want to sell those kind of products anymore. But a pen is still a pen, and a pen still works, right? So there's no reason why that product would go to waste. So we would buy these products at heavily discounted prices, and then because we got access to these products at such low prices, we would also be able to sell them to consumers and to businesses for much lower prices as well. So everyone kind of won, right? The FMCG won because they gave a value to their unsold inventory. We won as the intermediary, and then the consumer or the brand would also win by gaining access to these products at heavily discounted prices.
It's like this disparity where you've got an oversupply of food in some places and then obviously undersupply of food in other places. That's obviously more of a global issue, but I imagine also of the consumer, like if you look at the supply chain, as you said, there's food loss or food waste at every step.
About 1/3 of all the food that is produced globally never reaches the supermarket, which is a lot.
As we mentioned in your intro, that you were at Gorillas and Choco, and also Deliveroo. So these are like quite fast-paced startups, and you were an employee. How do you know it was the right time? What do you think were the misconceptions from like this whole idea of you're an employee in a fast-growing startup, and now you're an entrepreneur and a founder? What's been that journey like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this is somewhat a very personal question because I think it's very subjective and it definitely depends on each individual person. But I personally wanted to do it 3 years ago, which is when I founded Beans, because that's when I felt I had built enough confidence in myself through being an employee at these companies. So when you spoke in the description about me seeking experiences that would give me the skills and the exposure, this is kind of what I meant. I felt that I had seen enough companies to kind of build myself the skills and the confidence to kind of go out and try to solve a problem for myself. But these experiences also gave me the professional maturity to kind of be able to say, okay, now I'm ready for this. I can do it myself. If I had to boil it all down to one thing, I would say it's timing.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that by then I had had enough startup experience that it kind of had reduced some of the mystery that revolves around being an entrepreneur. What's it going to be like? Is it, as time consuming, as stressful, fundraising, hiring, all these things. Another angle of timing that I think was also important for me is that at the time I was 29 years old, I was single, I had no kids. I thought it was the right time because it was taking less of a personal risk than naturally, someone who has a family and kind of carries that. And the final aspect of timing that for me was super important is that I had a lot of energy. I mean, I still do, obviously, but I think one of the things that you need to think about is that it's extremely energy consuming. So you have to have that energy and that hunger. And that's when I believe that all the conditions were kind of united for it to be the right timing for me. So it all comes down to timing, I would say. But at the end of the day, you're the one who knows whether that timing is right for you or not, right? I think the perfect timing, to sum all this up, for me, the perfect timing sits at the intersection of when you have a lot of energy, that hunger, but also that tiny little bit of fear, because that fear of the unknown, of the what's going to happen, that risk is what keeps you alert. It's what keeps you ambitious. It tells you that you're going to grow during this adventure because that's what kind of keeps you out of your comfort zone.
When you feel uncomfortable, that's the comfort zone, but that's where there's the most growth.
Exactly.
And what do you think are the top 3 tips that you would give to someone who wants to start their own thing, besides timing?
So specifically for an impact startup or a sustainability startup, the 3 main tips that I would give a new founder would be pick your area of impact and stick to it. So for example, with Beans, our area of impact was in food waste. We got a bit of backlash from some investors, some VCs. We got challenged quite a lot on, but you're reducing food waste, but isn't giving people access to products cheaper than supermarkets going to encourage them to also not necessarily be picky on what they're eating in terms of the nutritional value? So aren't people going to eat less healthy because you're giving them access to, candy and Coca-Cola and Nutella and all these unhealthy products? They are right to a certain extent. They're right in the sense that you got to pick your angle for impact. Our angle was food waste. Our angle was not nutrition. The reality is that the more you try to, have eggs in different baskets and, try to diversify your angle of impact, the less likely it is that you're going to have any real impact. So my first tip would really be pick your impact area and stick to it. The second tip that I would give was measure your impact from the very beginning in a very reliable and specific way. As Peter Drucker used to say, right? What can be measured can be managed.
Exactly.
So I think that's very important to keep it in mind, because a lot of people go into sustainability kind of like, yeah, okay, we'll do a bit of this, we'll do a bit of that, but then don't particularly measure it. And whether it's to raise funds, whether it's, to build your own reputation as a company, it's incredibly important that you're able to measure that impact, right? And to build your story and your narrative around it. Because yeah, not only for investors, but just the entire reputation and the entire stake of your company is going to be measured around that. Even for hiring, people come to you because you're building something that has impact. So you got to be able to back that statement up. And the final advice that I would give, which is something I actually learned during the Norskin Accelerator, the Norskin Impact Accelerator in Stockholm, is make sure that you set up your business model in such a way that every additional unit of growth, or growth in revenue, or growth in sales, or growth in whatever your growth is, to be an equivalent unit of impact. So that's essentially the way that we built it at Beans. Was for every additional sale that we made, the more every party involved would gain.
So to give a more detailed example.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it depends on every different business model, right? But just make sure that for every additional unit of growth, so I don't know, for every 10% increase in sales also equals a 10% increase or an equivalent percent increase in whatever your impact measure is. Tons of products saved, or it can be, number of people that you've helped, or whatever your measure is, whatever your KPI is for impact. Make sure that it's directly correlated to every additional unit of growth, meaning an increase in that particular KPI.
How do you find an amazing co-founder? Like, what was your journey there?
This is a really good question and a very tricky one, because the reality is that you not only spend more of your waking hours with your co-founder than you do with, your life partner, but it's also administratively harder to separate from a co-founder than it is from an actual husband or wife, right? So who you choose is incredibly, incredibly important. I was super fortunate to have met my co-founder at Gorillas. So we had the chance to work together previously, which I think already put us in like a natural, good predisposition to work together. Because although we had only worked together for 3 months, I mean, working at Gorillas for 3 months is the equivalent of a couple of years in a lot of other companies due to, the sheer speed of the way that things were happening. But if I had to narrow it down to a few things to look for, is I would say complementarity, both in terms of personality and skills. So for example, my co-founder, I always say that in co-founding teams, you have like the serious one who often ends up being the CEO. The one who's more responsible for the admin side, the cash flow, being the public face of the company, etc. One person that's the geek, so like the one with the technical background, and then one person which is what I call the crazy one. So not to be misunderstood, but the crazy one, there always has to be one person that brings the more dreamer side, the more ambitious side, the one who brings the vision, the one who helps create the culture, that kind of thing. So that's what I mean by complementarity in terms of personality, but also in terms of skills. So you'll have one person that is, perhaps better at, marketing, or, go to market, or that kind of thing. And then one person who's better at the whole admin, HR, finance, who's going to be more responsible for fundraising, that sort of stuff. The other thing that I think is incredibly important to look for is easiness of conflict resolution. So have a look at how each person, handles stress. How are you going to resolve problems when they arise? Because in a startup, you might get along incredible, and at the beginning everything is super exciting and everything is new and it's exciting and there's new stuff happening all the time and it's fun. There's undoubtedly a time where shit's gonna hit the fan and things are gonna get more difficult, or everyone has personal lives. A startup's life, it's not a story of a couple of years, right? So things happen, people get married, people lose people, friendships happen, love, heartache happens, all that happens. And so how people deal with the stress, the personal stress, but also the stress of the ups and downs of the company itself, directly impact how conflict is resolved between co-founders. So I think that's definitely something that is incredibly important to look for. The first thing I would do once you have that kind of part sort of squared away, where you already know who you want to found your company with, is I would sit down with that person. That's what my co-founder Louis and I did at the very beginning. We sit down to have a really honest conversation about vision and especially about expectations. So where do you want to take this company? Are you both in it for the same time or for the same reasons? Or is one of you really in it, for the money and the fame, and is the other in it for the personal learnings? Do you want to grow? Does one of you want to grow it fast and sell it fast, or do you want to grow it slowly but sustainably? You need to be aligned on all these things before you jump together, before you jump into bed together. I don't say that. I'm not saying that you have to agree on everything, but you at least have to understand, be honest with yourself and with your co-founder about what your expectations and priorities are. And more concretely, I think this could be helpful. There's plenty of founder complementarity sheets online. We personally used the Y Combinator one and the Antler ones to build our own, just to make sure that we had all these conversations before actually going out and founding Beans together.
I love those tips, super actionable as well, because I can imagine the context, which is probably pretty obvious, but I would say that the stakes are very high in this kind of situation. So, well, it's amazing that you had your co-founder who is obviously a really good fit. But what do you think is the main difference that you can see between people that are kind of like more operators to actually found and run a business? It's so much harder, as that difference between employee and founder and like business owner. What kind of separates that?
I think it all ultimately boils down to the level of involvement. At the end of the day, when you're an employee, you shut down your laptop. You're not the one who's staying awake at night or working on weekends, worried about how things are going to go, because you're not the one that has a personal stake in it. So it takes a particular level of courage, I would say. As an employee at a certain level, there's a minimal level of distance, right? It's not your company. You might care a great deal. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be a fantastic employee. But great operators will do just that. They will operate incredibly well, but their level of involvement or care will never be the same as a founder's. So operators have a tendency to be, and this is a huge advantage, right? Operators are more down to earth, where founders are more dreamers in general, I would say. That's why I actually believe that the best founders are ex-operators.
I know that Beans was relatively small in terms of number of employees. Each hire that you make is a huge, impact on the company. So, who were your first hires? Where did you focus on?
Our very, very first hire was founder's associate, which we then promoted 2 years later. We then promoted her to chief of staff. I think that at the very beginning, having one sort of Swiss Army knife, as I call them, that is not particularly specialized, someone that's quite the generalist, but that has the ability to wear a lot of different hats, who's really trustworthy, because the first employee is someone that as founders, you're going to share things with them that you don't necessarily share with anyone else, not even with your board members, to be honest. They're also responsible for the culture. So I think at the beginning, whether it's the first employee or the first, 10, 15 employees, I think you need to hire them for the human fit, the personal fit that you have with the person as well, because they're going to be the ones that are responsible for the culture. Founders think that it's them. It's actually not them, because they're too busy having, their heads in different places. The ones who are really responsible for the culture are going to be your first employee and the subsequent first, 10 hires. They will take things from each founder, and they will be the ones who are going to create the rituals. They're going to be the ones who create, the traditions. They're going to be the one to organize, the birthdays and remember important events and things like that. They're going to be the ones who make sure that the next 10 employees find their place, etc. Our first employee, Emily, she's the best hire I did in my entire career ever. I could not recommend her enough. She was absolutely fantastic. She honestly challenged us. She disagreed with us when we had to. She was so motivated, so diligent. She was also on a human, on a character level. She was just so pleasant to be around, always bringing a sort of lightheartedness to everything in an incredibly positive way, right? Because as a founder, it's also being an entrepreneur can be a very lonely environment, right? And having a first employee who's always there to remind you that a tiny setback is not the end of the world, is incredibly refreshing. sometimes as founders, you have to have your head in a million different places. And Emily was really the one who made sure that we went into enough depth into every single aspect. Actually, my very my first full-time job was also as a startup's first employee, where I stayed 3 years. I really do believe that this put me on the right track to become a founder myself. I think a first employee is an incredibly key role and key hire for any startup. And as a
Yeah.
first employee, being able to deal with the changes and deal with the ambivalence, it's not a soft skill anymore. It's the hard skill that you should be looking for. Because then you don't need someone that's like specialized in anything in particular, although your business might require it, if your company has like a specific, technology or something like that. But in our case, it's something that we could outsource, especially at the beginning when, you haven't raised yet, you're bootstrapping, you haven't been able to, hire more people full time. That's something that's relatively easier to outsource. And then after that first employee, once you already kind of have the basis covered, and once as the founding team plus the first employee, you're no longer able to do everything yourselves, that's when we started looking at hiring specialized people for the particular functions. So, one person for marketing, one person for purchasing, who would come with, with the understanding of how to write these kind of contracts, how to negotiate with FMCGs, and also came with quite the address book of people to contact in the sector. So yeah, first employee first, an incredible Swiss Army knife, super motivated person, potentially someone who wants to become a founder later on. So it's more about the energy that they bring, and dealing with all this ambivalence and being able to wear many hats and dealing with the uncertainty. And then you start hiring for more specialized roles.
Ines, thank you. How did you figure that out before making it?
That's actually a really good question, because obviously these are very difficult things to test for, right? It's not a 1 + 1 = 2 type of test. I think for that hire, you definitely have to meet the person. So I've been involved in a few roles where I didn't even meet my bosses or my teammates after months of already being on the job. That's personally not how I would do it, because I think that things flow very differently when you meet the person face to face. So again, similarly as with a co-founder, you're going to spend so much time with this person that one of the things that I think you need to ask yourself when you're hiring for this person has to be, okay, would I spend a weekend with this person? Would I spend, a lot of late night evenings with this person? Would I have dinner with this person? Would I want to, hang out with this person? So I think that's one sort of easy thing that's going to create like a kind of first filter. I don't think at this stage it is at all about the person's experience. For me, it's much more about attitude. So how you test for this attitude is putting them in different situations. Like, okay, imagine that you arrive, I don't know, at the warehouse, and one of the warehouse manager was sick that day and didn't call in sick, so the warehouse manager is not there, and everyone's outside and no one has the key. How do you make sure that everyone gets to work all right? Seeing how they walk through the problem, seeing how they answer the question, see how they think outside the box, seeing what attitude they have towards it. Or another example can be, I don't know, you have to you notice something that's being done wildly wrong within the company. How do you make an internal case to the founders about how to change the way things are being done? So that's a bit more tricky, right? Because you kind of have to go not against, but have to challenge the founders about something that they built, and how you think that it can be improved. So that's kind of how you test whether they're gonna be, the ones that are gonna like brush in your sense, or are they going to challenge you, how they're going to go about it, all these things. So I really think that it's not about their background, it's not about the experience, it's not about what fancy school they went to. It's really about the person's character, their resourcefulness, their attitude towards things.
One phrase I heard recently: people looking for people that run towards problems. So people that are actually going to go and try and solve stuff, and not like, are not shy to tackle them, and they actually come up with these things themselves. So when you say, let's fix something the way that we're doing at the moment, like they come up with that themselves. And of course it has to be in line with the business priority or improve the business in some way, not like a random project, but like they have that creativity and proactivity as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Proactivity. That's actually a word that I didn't say, but it's definitely a very important one.
So you scaled Beans from, it was the two co-founders, and then you had the founders associated with them. There were how many people at the company?
Including some people that we had working for us part-time, we had 10.
Who were those first 5 hires? I think you briefly mentioned you had someone in marketing, purchasing, and then something else, right?
Yeah, the way that we set out to identify the first specialized hires that we need to make was, okay, what are the blind spots that my co-founder and I have? Or which are the areas that are easily outsourceable is not the word. Things that you can easily delegate without needing someone, with particular skills. So what can you easily delegate? And what don't you actually have the knowledge for in-house? So those are like the two main questions that we asked ourselves. So the first person that we hired was marketing, because my co-founder and I had done a bit of marketing each in different companies, but neither of us was specialized in marketing. So the first person that we hired, he was actually with us for the entire duration of the company, but he was in a freelance contract, mainly because he was a CMO with 15 years of experience in this sector, and there's no way that we could have afforded him full time. But we made the strategic decision of, instead of hiring someone much more junior for that particular role that we could have hired full time, we decided to hire this person. He was only with us 2 days a week, but those 2 days a week with his level of experience and his level of expertise were completely worth it. So that was one of the key decisions that we made at the very beginning. He helped us structure the entire, marketing setup, helped us, identify who are the right people to hire for this department and so on. And then we would be the ones to execute on it. Another person that we hired very early on was someone to do in charge of purchasing. So as I mentioned earlier, working with FMCGs is not particularly easy. You can't just, knock on Nestle's door and be like, "Hi, can I buy your inventory?" Yeah, they're gonna be like, okay, who are you? So that requires, a bit of tact and a bit of, getting to know, knowing the right people and knowing how to talk to them. So it's kind of like a mixture of specialized category management, because that person needs to understand what are the right products to buy, because obviously on our e-commerce website, so particularly on the B2C side, it's not about, okay, let's find as many products as we can and just put them on the website. It's about, okay, which are the products that people want to see, what are the products that people want to buy. So that level of scale required someone with prior category management experience, and then this person would also need to have the sales skills to be able to go out there, reach out to as many FMCGs as possible and see, being able to understand, okay, they're, put them into different groups. So you have, smaller brands, larger brands, brands that are parts of, houses of brands, etc. So that you really would be able to, tailor your communications, your presentations, your pitch, your negotiation, everything to the person that you have in front of you. So these were the two main specialized hires that we did at the very beginning.
So what about sales as a startup? There's a couple of thoughts I have on this, but I would love to understand how you see the difference.
I think the first difference between a smaller brand and like a big multinational brand would be understanding two things. First is what their internal processes are. Each brand is going to deal with waste. There's no universal way in which all brands deal with waste, right? So first of all is understanding how each of the brands deal with their own waste, because some might already have systems in place. So it might not be a priority for you to reach out to them because they don't have like a need for the solution that you're providing. We can also see this in a different way, which is, how do you convince them that you're the best person to dispose of this, but that's a whole different topic. But essentially is what do their internal processes look like so that you can tailor your solution to their need. And then the second thing would be, who is the decision maker? Because internally the stakeholders are very different, right? If it was a smaller brand, then it would sometimes even be the CEO. It would be someone in the C-suite, or it would even be someone in HR. We've seen that a couple of times before. However, in a big brand, there would be either, a very, very developed supply chain department, or there would be a sustainability team in place. So understanding who is the right stakeholder for you to talk to and for you to sell the solution to is incredibly key. We spent a lot of time in the beginning, figuring this out, understanding how the brands work internally before we even tried to contact them, because just getting to the right person is really important.
Was there any specific hire that changed things dramatically in a positive way?
For us, it was definitely the first employee that I told you about. I think it's an incredibly key role. I think who you hire at that point, the first person that you hire, regardless of the role that you put them in. So we put them in a founder's associate position, which was, kind of like a generalist. As I said, I love the expression, the Swiss Army knife kind of person. These things, they're not completely irreversible, right? So I don't know. I think it's important at any point in a startup to just, get out there, test things. If it doesn't work, you change it, and that's fine. But don't be afraid to test things. I see a lot of founders, and even ourselves, right? My co-founder and I, where we like things to be perfect, and we like, to gather the perfect conditions before you actually go out and do something. But the more you test, the more you iterate, the faster you're going to find what's right for your company. And also, we all have a tendency to think that what's worked for us in the past is what's going to work for us now. But the model is different from, Beans' model was different from Choco, from Gorillas, from Deliveroo, even though it was all in the food space. The business model was different. The market conditions were different. Consumer behavior is different. So at the end of the day, it's not because it's worked for you in the past that it's necessarily going to work for you now. So just get out there and test things. And always think about the reversibility of decisions that you make.
Do you think that you would describe yourself as someone that takes risks?
I do see myself as someone who takes risks, but as I said, it's about understanding that risk and understanding the reversibility of all the decisions that you take. So will you become a founder and your company doesn't succeed? Is it going to be the end of the world? No, because you're going to walk away with tons of learnings. Well, maybe you won't have made a lot of money during those months or years or however long it is. But you'll come out stronger with a lot more experience, great network, and something to show for it. But it definitely does take courage because, as I said earlier, it can be very lonely. A lot of people don't understand why it is that you do what you do. I alienated a lot of my surroundings, a lot of my friends, a lot of my family, because they didn't understand, why are you working weekends? Why are you, not coming home this summer? Or, why aren't you home for Christmas? And they just won't understand, right? And it's going to make you feel like you're making the wrong choices and that you're not doing things right. But it takes courage to go through with it. There's a lot of uncertainty also, will it work? Even within, internal things, right? Is this the right process for this? Is this the right hire for this? Is this the right investor for me? And so on. So I think that in itself takes a risk taker to build.
And this kind of ties into what you said at the beginning of our conversations, that the energy that you need and how much energy can you give, because it's all of these decisions, it's change, it's this whole idea of like decision fatigue at the end of a Friday or maybe even Saturday, because you're working, you've made 500 decisions that week. How do you like keep going and start again on Monday?
My co-founder and I used to have this joke about whenever we would eat out, he would always order the exact same thing that I would. He would always like, no, you order first, and then okay, same for me. And I think that was, very clearly the decision fatigue, where you go to a restaurant, there's so much choice. Oh, you can't decide. I don't really know what I want. Okay, let me just make it easier. I'll have whatever she's having. And whether it's, getting dressed in the morning, there's stories about founders who would either, go even beyond, picking their clothes the day before, but just having, the same t-shirt, same trousers in a bunch of different colors, mix and match, zero decision making, just, get up, have a shower, throw on whatever, and get to work. Decision fatigue is definitely a thing.
And saving those brain cells for things which are highly impactful, not just, okay, what does this look like? I guess it's all right for today, but is this going to make a huge difference? versus something else.
Yeah, and then getting to know yourself beyond that point, to really understand what are the things that give you this energy back, what drains your energy, what gives you energy back. These are all like big parts of being a founder.
What would you say like revitalizes you?
So me personally, it's interesting because I always thought of myself as a very social person. I would always get a lot of energy from, being out with friends, having social interactions and so on. Since I became a founder, for the very first time, I had to schedule in time to rest. That I had never in my life had that before, having to schedule in time to rest. A lot of the times, Friday would come and I would be so exhausted and so drained that I could never ever do anything on a Friday evening, ever. All I would be able to do was to sleep. But then I think it really is about finding balance, because you can't isolate too much, because then if you isolate too much, then that also drains your energy. So I think it's a lot about listening to your body, listening to the signs that it gives you. Sleep when you're tired, eat when you're hungry, work out when you're overthinking, and don't, alienate yourself, and find the balance for yourself, because at the end of the day, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint.
So, for someone listening right now who kind of wants to build an impact for sustainability, but they haven't really taken that leap, like maybe it's been brewing in their mind for a couple years, potentially, what would you tell them directly
I will tell
if you
them
could
to go
talk to
for
them?
it. I will tell them that it's an incredibly rewarding experience. But jokes aside, and more concretely, I will tell them to learn to deal with rejection, because rejection is definitely part of it, whether it's, candidates who are going to choose another company over you, to investors who are going to pick another company over you as well, to clients who are also going to choose a competitor over you. Rejection is going to be a part of it. So that's the first piece of advice that I would give. And it kind of ties in nicely with the second one, which is learn to get over things quickly. The more you dwell on things, the longer you spend, dwelling on things, the less stuff you're going to get done. So the more you're able to get done in a shorter period of time, at the end of the day, startups are all about execution. Plans don't matter. The market doesn't care about your plans. Investors don't care about your plans. Actually, that's a lie. Investors do care about your plans, but the market doesn't care about your plan. So what I would say is, yeah, learn to deal with rejection, learn to get over things quickly, iterate, pick the right co-founder, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and remember that it's a marathon and not a sprint.
If you have, a bad conversation or a potential customer says no this morning, don't let it affect your whole day. Just get over it, learn from it, and then like have another conversation with someone else.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Or go see Emily, your amazing first employee, and she will, get you back in a happy mood and on to the next thing.
Thank you, Ines, for sharing your
Thank
insights. It was helpful and inspiring. So if people want to find out more or they want to like just, connect with you, where can they find you online?
They can find me on LinkedIn. It's Ines Sánchez Castillo Velge. If anyone, feel free to reach out. If my story can inspire other people, then what else can I ask for?
Really appreciate your time.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Magda.
much.
Bye.
Bye bye.